Let me tell you about the worst decision I've ever made, and the night I thought I was going to die. It still doesn't feel real, even though every detail is buried into my memory. My name's James Norris, and I'm a welder by trade. I've spent most of my life in and out of factories and shipyards, working with my hands, and I've always thought of myself as a pretty grounded guy. I've got this hobby of painting miniatures for Warhammer 40k. I know, not the most typical thing for a blue-collar guy, but it's relaxing, or it was until all of this happened. It started as a simple idea: take a break, get out of the city. Spent a few days in a cabin in the woods. My buddy Eric had a place in the middle of nowhere, tucked away in the swamps of Louisiana. He couldn't make it, so he offered me the keys, said I could use it for a few days to clear my head. I'd been feeling burned out, so I thought, why not? A little isolation sounded perfect. When I got there, it was already raining. Not a gentle summer drizzle, but the kind of rain that slams against the windows and makes the whole world feel smaller. The cabin was cozy enough though. A single room with a little kitchen, a bed, and an old stove. I had some books, my miniatures, and a bunch of supplies to last me a week. The first night was uneventful. I painted a few figures, listened to the rain, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But by the second night, things started to get strange. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a soft scratching sound, like nails on wood. At first I thought it was a branch brushing against the cabin, but then it moved, from one wall to the next, slow and deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The rain had let up a little, but the ground was a swampy mess. I didn't see anything, but the air felt wrong, thicker than before, heavy with the sense of unease. I chalked it up to my imagination and went back inside, locking the door behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud around the cabin. They weren't human, too large, with long toes and what looked like claw marks. I don't know how to explain it, but they made my skin crawl. That night, it started again. The scratching, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I stayed inside, gripping the hatchet I'd brought for chopping firewood, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw it. Through the rain-streaked window, I caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the tree line. It was tall, thin, and unnaturally gaunt. Its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its movements were jerky, almost insect-like. I froze. I'd seen something like it before, but not in real life, in a game. A game I played a few months back had a creature based on the Wendigo, and whoever designed it must have known what they were talking about because this thing looked just like it. It prowled around the cabin, circling slowly, its eyes never leaving the windows. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the hatchet like my life depended on it. The thing didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. It was like it was waiting for something. Eventually, it disappeared into the woods, but I didn't sleep that night. By the next evening, I was ready to leave. I packed my things and waited for the rain to let up enough to make a run for it. But the Wendigo had other plans. It came back as the sun was setting, slamming against the cabin walls with enough force to make the whole place shake. I barricaded the door with a chair and grabbed the hatchet, trying to keep my breathing steady. The creature's attacks were relentless. It clawed at the windows, its pale face appearing for brief horrifying moments before vanishing again. And then it got inside. I don't even know how it happened. One moment I was braced against the door, and the next it was there, its bony frame filling the doorway. Its stench was overwhelming, like rotting meat and damp earth. I swung the hatchet, catching it across the arm. It let out this ear-piercing screech, a sound that made my teeth ache, and lashed out at me with claws that looked like they could tear through steel. I don't know how, but I managed to dodge and run out of the back door. The rain pouring down in sheets as I sprinted through the woods. The creature was right behind me, its screeches echoing through the trees. Somehow I made it to the main road. I was soaked, bleeding, and barely able to stand. but I kept running until I saw headlights. The driver, a trucker, heading to Baton Rouge, slammed on his brakes when he saw me. I must have looked like a madman, screaming and waving my arms, but he let me in. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the Wendigo standing at the edge of the woods, its glowing eyes watching as we disappeared into the night. I don't go out in the woods anymore. I don't even camp. And whenever I hear the rain against the windows, I can't help but think of that night and wonder if it's still out there, waiting. Well, that was a scary story, everyone. Wendigos, as I've mentioned, are really creeping me out. It seems we have a few more Wendigo stories and one Dogman. So thank you for joining and enjoy the rest of the stories. You know, I've always thought of myself as a pretty tough guy. Being a mechanic from Miami and spending half my free time in the gym, I figured I could handle just about anything life threw at me. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened on that hunting trip in the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, just me and 3 friends. Mike, a retired cop who never left home without his trusty Glock, Sarah, an avid hunter with a custom-made bow, and Joe, the youngest of the group and a self-proclaimed outdoorsman who never stopped talking about his hunting rifle. We were all excited for a few days in the wilderness, tracking deer and forgetting about the world for a while. The season was spring, but the Pacific Northwest had other ideas. Snow blanketed the ground and the weather was freezing. It was beautiful though, the kind of pristine wilderness you only see in postcards or movies. Speaking of movies, I couldn't help but think back to this horror flick I'd seen years ago. Something about a Wendigo. I couldn't remember much about the plot, but the image of the emaciated predatory creature stuck with me. I joked about it to the group on the drive up. Hope we don't run into anything out here that's not in season, I'd said. They laughed it off, but if I'd known what was coming, I wouldn't have brought it up. The first day was uneventful. We found a good spot to set up camp, built a fire, and spent the evening sharing stories and planning the next day's hunt. The snow made tracking easier, and we spotted plenty of fresh deer tracks. Spirits were high, and we felt like we were in for a good trip. The trouble started on the second day. We'd been following a trail through the woods when Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all froze, listening. At first I didn't hear anything, but then it came, a faint rustling sound too deliberate to be the wind. Mike waved us to stay quiet, his hand hovering over the Glock on his hip. "Probably just an animal," Joe said, though his voice wavered. "Maybe," Sarah replied, but she didn't sound convinced. We moved on, but the feeling of being watched stayed with us. Every now and then I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees, just out of sight. It was too big to be a deer, and whatever it was following us. "Could be a bear," Mike muttered, though he didn't sound sure. Sarah shook her head. "Bears don't stalk people like this." We decided to head back to camp. The tracks we'd been following could wait. That night, things got worse. We were sitting around the fire, trying to shake off the unease from earlier, when Joe noticed something. "Where's the meat?" he asked, pointing to the cooler. It was gone. At first we thought an animal had snuck into the camp and taken it, but there were no tracks leading to or from the cooler. It was like the meat had just vanished. The rustling started again, this time closer. Mike and Sarah grabbed their weapons while Joe and I armed ourselves with whatever we could find, a hunting knife for me and a sturdy branch for Joe. We scanned the darkness, the fire casting long flickering shadows, and then we saw it. At the edge of the firelight, something moved. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and impossibly thin, with long clawed fingers and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its face was twisted, almost human, but not quite. "It's a Wendigo," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop myself. The creature didn't move closer, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, watching us. We didn't sleep that night. The next day, we decided to leave. Whatever was out there wasn't something we wanted to mess with. We packed up quickly and started back toward the road. That's when it happened. Joe was walking ahead when we heard a scream. We turned to see him being dragged into the woods, his rifle lying abandoned in the snow. "Joe!" Sarah shouted, running after him with her bow drawn. Mike and I followed, the snow crunching under our boots as we raced through the trees. We found him a few minutes later, unconscious but alive, lying in the snow. His face was pale and he was muttering something under his breath, but he wouldn't wake up. The Wendigo wasn't far. It stalked us from the shadows, its glowing eyes a constant reminder that we weren't alone. We carried Joe as fast as we could, every step feeling like a lifetime. The creature didn't attack again, but it didn't stop following us either. When we finally reached the road, we flagged down a passing truck. The driver, an older man with a no-nonsense attitude, helped us load Joe into the back and drove us to the nearest town. Joe eventually woke up, but he couldn't remember what happened. None of us could explain what we'd seen, and honestly, I don't think we wanted to. I haven't been back to the woods since. The gym feels a lot safer, and these days I stick to fixing cars, but every now and then, when it's quiet, I think about those glowing eyes and wonder if the Wendigo is still out there, waiting for its next meal. Let me tell you, I've been in plenty of fights in my life. The cage isn't exactly a forgiving place. In being an MMA fighter means you learn how to take a punch as well as you give one. But what I'm about to tell you, this wasn't like any fight I've ever been in. This wasn't something you could train for. It all started last winter. Me and 3 buddies, Nate, Carlos and Jake, decided we needed a break from the usual grind. Carlos had heard about this little town called Bladenboro in North Carolina. Said it was small, quiet, and had some great back roads for a long drive, perfect for clearing our heads and just hanging out. Now, I'd read about Bladenboro before, not in travel guides or anything like that, but in those old yellow-tinked newspapers they sell in gas stations, the ones with stories about UFOs, ghosts, and cryptids. Bladenboro was famous for the Beast of Bladenboro, this supposed vampire-like creature from the 1950s that killed livestock and terrified the locals. I didn't think much of it at the time, it was just another urban legend to me, but man, if I'd known what was waiting for us, I'd have stayed in New Orleans and stuck to hitting the gym. The trip started off fine. We left early in the morning, the snow coming down in thick heavy flakes that turned the landscape into a whiteout. It was beautiful in a way, like something out of a postcard. We took our time on the road, stopping here and there to check out the scenery and mess around. Nate even brought a pair of binoculars, claiming he wanted to spot some wildlife. By the time we reached Bladenboro, the sun was starting to set and the snow was piling up fast. We decided to take one of the less traveled roads out of town, hoping to find a good spot to park and stretch our legs. We found this narrow dirt path that cut through the woods and decided to follow it. Big mistake. We'd only been driving for about 10 minutes when the first sign of trouble appeared. Jake, who was behind the wheel, slammed on the brakes. "Did you see that?" he said, his voice tight. "See what?" I asked, leaning forward. "Something ran across the road," he said. "Big, like bigger than a deer." Carlos laughed. "Probably just a bear," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. We all got out of the car to take a look, but the snow had already covered whatever tracks might have been there. Still, there was this heaviness in the air, like we weren't alone. I didn't say anything, but I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. We got back in the car and kept driving, but it wasn't long before we saw it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. It was standing in the middle of the road, its glowing yellow eyes locked on us. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with a hunched posture and long, powerful limbs. Its fur was dark and matted, and its face, God, its face looked like some twisted mix of a wolf and a man. "Is that..." Nate started, but the thing let out this blood-curdling howl that cut him off. Jake didn't wait. He threw the car into reverse, but before we could get far, the thing lunged at us. It slammed into the hood with enough force to dent the metal, its claws scraping against the windshield. "Go, go, go!" Carlos shouted, and Jake floored it, swerving around the creature and speeding down the road. We thought we'd lost it, but we were wrong. It followed us, running alongside the car like it was nothing. Every now and then, it would dart ahead, disappearing into the trees before reappearing just as suddenly. It was toying with us, and it knew it. Then it happened. The thing jumped out of the woods and landed on the roof of the car. The whole vehicle shook, and we could hear its claws tearing into the metal. Jake lost control, and we skidded off the road, crashing into a snowbank. We scrambled out of the car, grabbing whatever we could use as weapons. Jake had a tire iron, Carlos a hunting knife, and Nate, well, he grabbed a flashlight. I didn't have anything but my fists, which felt pretty useless against something like that. The creature circled us, its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. It moved with this eerie predatory grace, like it was sizing us up. When it attacked, it went for Carlos first. He managed to slash at it with his knife, but it barely seemed to notice. It swiped at him, sending him flying into the snow. Nate and Jake tried to fight it off, but it was too fast, too strong. I don't know what came over me, but I charged at it. I landed a punch, square, in its side, and for a second I thought I might have actually hurt it. But then it turned those glowing eyes on me, and I knew I was in trouble. It swiped at me, its claws barely missing as I ducked. I grabbed a branch from the ground and swung it with everything I had, catching it across the face. It let out this unearthly growl and backed off, giving us just enough time to make a run for it. We didn't stop running until we hit the main road. I don't know how long we ran or how we managed to keep going, but eventually we flagged down a passing truck. The driver didn't ask questions, he just took one look at us and told us to get in. We never went back for the car. Whatever that thing was, it could keep it. To this day, I can't explain what we saw out there. Maybe it was the dogman, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is I'm not going back to Bladenboro. Ever. You know, I've been through a lot. Being a soldier teaches you how to handle pressure, how to face things most people never ever dream of. But no amount of training, no time spent in the gym or on the battlefield could have prepared me for what happened that night in the Appalachians. It started off innocent enough. My buddies and I, Marcus, Eddie and Joe, were driving through the mountains on a long road trip. We were all taking a few days off to unwind, to leave behind the stress of duty and everyday life. I'd been missing my wife and kids back in Lawrence, Kansas, but I figured a little time away would do me good. The season was autumn, but that night snow had started to fall unexpectedly. The roads were slick and the world around us was blanketed in white. It was kind of beautiful in a way, the way the snow settled on the trees and turned the mountains into something out of a postcard. But the beauty came with an eerie stillness that I couldn't shake. We were running low on gas, so we decided to stop at this old rundown gas station we spotted off the main road. It was one of those places you only see in horror movies, flickering neon signs, a single pump, and a rickety wooden building that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. "Man, this place gives me the creeps," Eddie muttered as we pulled up. "Relax," Marcus said. "We're just here for gas, not a seance." I laughed, but it felt forced. There was something about the place that didn't sit right with me. Joe and I went inside to pay while Marcus and Eddie stayed outside to pump gas. The interior of the gas station was just as unsettling as the exterior. The shelves were half empty, stocked with dusty cans of food and a few ancient candy bars. Behind the counter sat an old man who barely looked up as we approached. "We need to fill up," I said, sliding a few bills across the counter. The old man nodded slowly, his milky eyes meeting mine. "You boys shouldn't be out here tonight," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Why's that?" Joe asked, raising an eyebrow. The old man leaned forward. "This land, it's cursed. There's something out there in the woods, something hungry." I exchanged a glance with Joe, trying not to laugh. I'd heard stories like this before, local legends meant to scare outsiders. Still, there was something about the way the old man spoke that sent a shiver down my spine. We didn't stick around to hear more. After paying, we headed back outside, where Marcus and Eddie were waiting. The snow was falling heavier now, and the wind had picked up, howling through the trees like some kind of warning. As we got ready to leave, we heard it. A sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was this guttural, bone-chilling howl that seemed to echo from the deep within the woods. We all froze, our eyes scanning the tree line. "What the hell was that?" Marcus whispered. "Probably just a coyote," Eddie said, though his voice was shaky. But it wasn't a coyote. I knew that much. We got back in the car and drove off, but the atmosphere had changed. The joking, the laughing from earlier were gone, replaced by a tense silence. Every now and then, I'd catch Marcus glancing into the rearview mirror, like he was expecting something to appear. It wasn't long before we found ourselves in trouble. The snow had gotten so bad that the road was barely visible, and when Marcus tried to take a turn, the car skidded off the road and into a ditch. We all got out to assess the damage. The car wasn't going anywhere, and there wasn't a soul in sight to help us. "Great," Eddie muttered. "Now what?" "We walk," I said, trying to keep everyone calm. "There's got to be a town or a house nearby." We grabbed what we could from the car: flashlights, a crowbar, a hunting knife Joe had brought along for some reason, and started walking. The forest around us was silent, except for the crunch of snow under our boots. And then we heard it again. That same unearthly howl, closer this time. "Okay, what the hell is that?" Marcus said, gripping the crowbar tightly. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to keep moving." As we walked, the howls grew louder, and soon we could hear something moving in the woods. It stayed just out of sight, but every now and then we'd catch a glimpse, a shadow darting between the trees, a pair of glowing eyes in the darkness. "It's stalking us," Joe said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart pounding. I'd seen a movie about Wendigos once, years ago. I remembered the legend, how they were said to be people who turned to cannibalism and became monsters, cursed to roam the wilderness forever. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff, but whatever was following us felt wrong. The creature finally made its move when we reached the clearing. It came out of nowhere, a blur of pale skin and long twisted limbs. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its mouth was full of jagged teeth. Marcus swung the crowbar at it, but it was too fast, dodging his attacks and slashing at him with its claws. Marcus went down, blood staining the snow. Joe and I tried to fight it off, but it was like trying to fight a nightmare. Eddie managed to stab it with the hunting knife, and for a moment it seemed to back off, letting out a screech that made my blood run cold. "Run!" I shouted, and we took off, leaving the creature behind. We eventually found our way back to the main road, where a passing truck stopped to help us. The driver took one look at us, bloody terrified and freezing, and didn't ask any questions. We never talked about what happened that night. I don't know what that thing was, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting for its next victims, and I'll never set foot in the Appalachians again. Those were all the stories for today, everyone. I hope you liked them, and apologies for any background noise. It seems all of my neighbors have decided to do renovations today. Thank you for joining, thank you for listening. Drop me a like or drop me a comment letting me know if you like the stories or not. Again, thank you for listening and good night.